Hello. This week, more a Dvar Torah than a formal sermon, as we look at Noso, the longest single parsha in the Torah, which contains a very broad mixture of materials, apparently unrelated, more of that shortly. A very brief run through the parsha, the responsibilities of the Gershon and Merari divisions of the Levi family are discussed, which parts of the Mishkan they will carry in the desert, and that's a continuation from Bamidbar, which we read last week. Then we discuss the purification of the camp, who must be banished from various places in the camp due to ritual impurity, a brief section dealing with offerings and confessions for certain sorts of wrongdoing, the Sota, the adulterous woman, the Nazir, the Nazarite, the most familiar section, the short but very important priestly blessing, and then an extremely long section to complete the parsha, the offerings of the princes, the inauguration, around the inauguration of the Mishkan. It seems like a completely unrelated selection of ideas, and it raises a question that has always fascinated me. Is juxtaposition a thing? Is it important to explore smichas haparshis, as the rabbis call it, the juxtaposition of sections in the Torah? And it's actually quite a significant question, not just for interest, because as we will see when we've had a chance to look at the juxtapositions in this week's parsha, the topic reveals much about the very nature of the Torah itself. So, before we explore the more existential question, the rabbis in the Midrashim and Rashi and the Ramban, our major commentators, do consider the text to be related, meaning even though the sections are not obviously linked, they try to find some thematic or chronological connection to explain why they appear one after the other. So to give you some sense of how this works, this is what the rabbis, Rashi, Ramban and the Talmudic rabbis have to say about this week's parsha. So we begin with a continuation of last week's reading about the Levitical duties. What happens next? Well, that's all been a very long digression, says Rashi. This has been a digression to get us back to the place where the Israelites were when the Mishkan was opened in Parsha Shemini, and we now need to know who should be in the camp and who not, who's going to be permitted to be part of that group who live around the Mishkan or not. So those who are impure have to be expelled. That's why that happens next. Now, the confession for wrongdoing, which follows, if you look closely in the text, it primarily refers to a construct called Gezel Hager. Gezel Hager means stealing from or appropriating the property of someone who's a convert and has no halachic family, how that is dealt with in law, and how we respond to those people who misappropriate the property of someone in that situation. Ramban explains that we're talking about a family living around the Mishkan, so we now need to discuss how certain members, perhaps marginal members of that family, have to be treated. Might seem a little far-fetched, but that's how he explains it. How do we deal with the Sota, the adulterous woman, that follows? Well, Rashi explains that since the previous section dealing with confession for wrongdoing talks about giving the relevant and appropriate parts of the animals of the offering to the Kohen, he says the following: if you don't give the right bits to the Kohen, you'll find yourself needing a Kohen to deal with the Sota ritual. Very perplexing, and again seems rather far-fetched. The next follows the Nazir, the Nazarite. Well, here's a Gemara. Someone who sees a Sota, an adulterous woman, in this state of shame, will swear off wine, will assume that wine was somehow involved in these wrongdoings, and will swear off wine. And of course, a Nazarite doesn't drink wine. Again, seems quite a far-fetched and quite possibly slightly offensive connection. Then we have the blessings that follow, the priestly blessings. According to the Ramban, we're still in essence talking about the opening ceremony of the Mishkan, and these are the blessings that would have been said then and afterwards. And finally, we're back in the story, which is the offerings that the princes brought, which conclude the parsha. So we see here ingenuity, creativity, sometimes stretching the limits of our credulity to accept how these parshas are linked. And in the case of the Sota, as I mentioned, certainly to modern sensitivities, some of these links between the Kohanim and the Sota and the Nazir are things that we might find objectionable, but they're from their time and in their context. I'm more interested in the principle that the rabbis are willing to go to quite extreme lengths, and the Rishonim, our major commentators, are willing to cite them doing so in order to establish that the text has a flow, that subject A, ostensibly unrelated to B, is in fact connected to it in some way. So this reveals something which I touched on a few weeks ago, which is an understanding which clearly inhabits Rashi's thought and the Ramban's thought, certainly because he says it explicitly in his introduction to the Torah, that the text isn't just a set of discrete commandments, but is in fact a seamless stream of divine consciousness, which therefore demands that they're not simply random sections, but they connect in some way. And it's not simply a law book peppered with narratives, which I believe is how the Ramban Maimonides would see the text, where each section has been conveyed by the divine, authorized and put together in the Torah at the end. And this is the Rambam's view in his introduction to the Mishnah, citing a Gemara in Gittin. But instead, while it contains law and narrative, there is something bigger. There is a stream of divine consciousness, and each chapter must follow chronologically or thematically or in some kind of transcendental way from the passage that follow, that precede it, rather than, as the Rambam might say, that it can be a collection of divine communications that are not necessarily linked to one another. The Ramban's opinion, which clearly has become the most prevalent one and is obviously the view of Rashi as well, is that we're dealing with a multi-layered, complex representation of divine cognition rather than simply a set of laws and narratives. So it does really matter whether or not we accept the specific juxtapositions. The principle of juxtaposition actually matters very much. You won't be surprised to hear that this is really a very ancient disagreement. There is a midrash a little bit later in the book of Dvarim, in which Rabbi Akiva, who is perhaps the most careful and maximalist reading of the Torah text, says, Kol parsha shehi samucha lechaverto lemedo hemeno. Any parsha, any section of the Torah, one can learn from what comes before and after it, meaning he understands that juxtapositions are significant. Whereas Rabbi, who is the author of the Mishnah, in contrast says, Harba parshas smuchas zolazo. There are many sections that are juxtaposed to one another. Urechoikas zo mizeh karochak mizrach lemarav, but they are as distant from each other as east is to west, meaning they've got nothing to do with each other. So this conversation has been going on since at least the 2nd century. Rabbi Akiva lived in the early 2nd century and Rabbi in the late 2nd century. They're not actually speaking to each other, but their views are recorded because they are in opposition to one another. Rav Yosef, a later writer in the Talmud, makes the following observation, which I find fascinating. There may indeed be a disagreement as whether we can darshan smuchos, whether it's legitimate to try to expound the significance of juxtapositions. But when it comes to Dvarim, the book of Mishnah Torah, where Moshe repeats in this great valedictory speech the laws of the Torah, everyone agrees that smuchos, that juxtapositions, are valid. And this is now obvious. It's a speech. I hope that when I speak and give sermons or talks, there's some kind of connection between one section and the next. When Moshe speaks, a speech certainly will be crafted in a way that there is an obvious connection and continuum from one section to the next. So that's a side point. We're never going to resolve this disagreement essentially between Rashi and the Ramban Maimonides in the medieval period, because it indeed reflects a much earlier disagreement in the second century. But for us, it's part of our exploration of Torah and trying to understand the very nature of the Torah, even while we might consider the juxtapositions a little far-fetched. The principle teaches us much about how we're to understand our holiest book. Wishing you a good Shabbos and sei gesund and stark.